Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this Friday with great weather. You taking some time out means a lot to us. So today we're going to discuss some features of being a radiation safety officer, what it kind of includes, the requirements when it comes to your state regulatory and your federal. A little background about myself. Spent close to 10 years in the food industry before joining Life and Safety. Kind of got thrown into the RSO role pretty quickly. Ended up kind of controlling 3 different facilities that had a total of 27 X-ray units across 3 different states. So it was a lot to gather and complete, but hopefully what my experience, I can kind of give you all some tips and tricks through this, what to expect if you guys are becoming an RSO or already are for your current facilities. For this webinar, I will say we're going to zone in more on South Carolina. If you're not operating in the South Carolina, please do verify. The regulations can be different from state to state. We just want to make sure that you are abiding by your state's regulatory guidelines. What to look for in this webinar, we're going to go over a basic understanding of what radiological safety is. And if you've ever been anything in radiation safety, you probably heard of their ALARA principle. Still applies a lot today. Types of X-ray equipment, we have different types. Not all equipment is created equally. The states are going to have different type of guidelines for each type of equipment. What to expect of being that radiation safety officer, the requirements regarding running that program for your facilities, labeling and signage. With anything in safety, you guys know the importance of having the proper labels around your facilities, on the equipment, just to let people aware what type of equipment you are dealing with. And along with everything, you need to have some type of operating procedure for your team members. Who are we training? How are we training these team members? What is the frequency of training them? And what are we training them on? So going to look at how and when these pieces of equipment need to be surveyed. These things just can't be put into your facility and kind of left alone like maybe a lot of other pieces of machinery. They need to be surveyed on different type of frequencies. So we're going to take a look at when and how you get those completed. You can't really expect to bring these into facilities without letting the state know either. These are regulated and they need to be registered with your state. We'll go through some documentation, and again, it's going to be kind of directed more to South Carolina, but we can definitely help you get you kind of the right contacts and point you to the direction of what state if you're not looking at South Carolina. And then lastly, just finishing up, we'll go over some training topics. What are some good items? It is to train your team members, talking about not just your RSOs, but anybody working on these pieces of equipment, working around these pieces of equipment. They need to have some type of radiation awareness type training. And we'll go over some topics on that. So if you experience, like I said previously, anything kind of related with radiation safety, you most likely have heard the ALARA principle. All right, it's been used for a long time, and it's still true to this day. So it's as low as reasonably achievable. Okay, it's a radiation safety guideline that aims to reduce that exposure to radiation to the lowest possible level. Okay, so it's a fundamental concept in radiation protection. All right, guiding professionals and minimizing that exposure to those ionizing radiation to the lowest levels. It's a cornerstone, always has been, of safety in industries and fields where radiation is used. But we look in manufacturing today, and more companies are inputting X-ray equipment into the facilities. And are they truly prepared to handle those type of pieces of equipment? But you look at their advantages and how efficient they have become. The main thing a lot of manufacturers are using today is to detect internal flaws. So you're talking about X-ray imaging can reveal hidden defects like cracks, voids, anything that's not visible from the outside to the eye. So it's a huge advantage to a lot of manufacturing companies, and that's why you're seeing more and more be used. Going over some elements of the ALARA. One, you need to verify that all equipment and your program is compliant with any regulatory requirements. You do not want them knocking on your door and asking you, where's all your paperwork, and you have no clue about it. So we'll go through that. Operating training. All team members, like I said, on and around that equipment need to have some type of training. Your surveys and monitoring, routine surveys and inspections are vital. All right, they need to be completed not only in the immediate area around the equipment, but you talk about the surrounding areas as well. Big advantage of getting these completed also for an RSO. It allows you to really evaluate that effectiveness of the shielding of the radiation, which we will discuss. Your safety systems, you need to verify that all safety systems on that piece of equipment are operating efficiently and effectively at all times. Making sure the equipment has controls to prevent leaks of radiation. Main focus is to make sure that equipment has adequate shielding to keep all that type of radiation inside. Access controls. You really want to limit the amount of people working in that area if you have a large amount of X-ray equipment. You want trained personnel around that area and limiting the access to people to reduce the dose. All right, so with the LARA principles, there's really three big things that you can kind of take into effect. They're basic methods, but they work so efficiently. All right, so time. All right, the amount of radiation exposure to directly proportionate to the time spent near that radiation source. So you're talking about the longer the exposure, the higher the radiation dose. So by minimizing that time, you have a team member around that source, that total dose received, of course, is going to be reduced. All right, prime example, you talk about the medical field. All right, technicians and medical staff that are doing x-rays all day with other people, they're not sitting in there with you while those people are getting those x-rays. They're leaving the area, getting away, and spending less time around that piece of equipment. All right. Distance. Radiation intensity decreases significantly as that distance from the source increases. So the longer as you get away from that source, the amount of dose is, of course, going to decrease. And I'm sorry about this jumping slides on me. When installing X-ray equipment to your facilities, you need to think about where you're placing them. Don't place them in an area where there's going to be a ton of foot traffic. Kind of want them away from areas that are shielded, is guarded. You're limiting the access to people in that area. All right, now for shielding. Shielding involves using those materials that absorb and block that radiation to reduce that total exposure. All right, so in industrial settings, you talk about walls or barriers made from materials. A lot of times it's concrete, your steel, any lead that's going to block out those radiation sources. So in conclusion, you look at those three items right there: time, distance, and shielding. Radiation doses can be significantly reduced, protecting your workers inside of your facilities. All right, so we're going to look at some different type of equipment. We're going to focus on kind of one section more than the other just for time reasons. But the first group is your human use type of equipment. All right, so it's going to be your chiropractor, your dental. Anytime you go get x-rays at the hospital or veterinarian, your animals, you'll see that very often. And these have different guidelines. So what we're going to discuss more in anything here. We're going to take a look at the non-human use x-rays. Okay, this is what's being brought into manufacturing facilities quite often now for many different reasons. That you could be for academic purposes, analytical, industrial, which we're going to focus on more than anything, and then lastly for security reasons as well. The great thing about industrial x-ray equipment used for non-destructive testing, like I said, they can do for quality checks. I know the food industry, we used them a lot. So if we were selling products that said no bones in it, we had to verify it with that x-ray. So the efficiency of them, the quality checks of them, they have been very, very convenient for manufacturers to install them. All right, so the best thing about these cabinet x-rays that's a little bit different than talking about a medical x-ray or veterinarian, that type of issue. The majority of those radiation emitted by that cabinet x-ray machine is contained and maintained inside that shielded cabinet itself. All right, so that picture you see on the right there, the source is actually inside that cabinet. It's going to do its best not to let anything out, okay? And you do this by your checks and your surveys, and we'll talk about that as well. At times, sometimes they are so contained, all right, so it is difficult to determine the difference from actually the dose from that source and actually just the actual background radiation you get on a normal basis, all right? So this is where the surveys will kind of get more detailed and you can figure out where the radiation source and all those dose reports are coming from, all right? So yes, looking at these, they're not as severe as this other type of machinery, but it's still very, very vital to make sure we are applying the LARA practices to that radiation safety program. All right, so some responsibilities. Sometimes it can be daunting with an RSO. You get thrown into a lot. So we're going to try to break it down and make it easier for somebody that is running that program. First, you're going to establish and oversee all operating emergency and LARA principles. Okay. The RSO develops, implements, you talk about the protocols, outline, all the sources, how we're going to handle them, store them, and use them safely. Training and education ensures that all personnel working with or near that radiation source receives adequate training on radiation hazards. They are responsible. It's not a one and done type training. You need to continuously train these team members and at least get something on the books annually to verify the team members working in that area do have that kind of awareness level type training. Right. Radiation monitoring and dose assessments. The RSO is going to oversee the monitoring of radiation levels in facilities. It's It's going to ensure that workers, the public, and the environment are not exposed to those unsafe radiation levels. If they're responsible for the personnel dosimetry program. So if you got team members going into areas that have to badge up with dosimetries, you're going to have to be responsible for making sure those are all up to date and reported properly. Regulatory compliance and documentation. All right, so there's a lot of documentation that goes along with these pieces of equipment. We'll break it down, but it's a constant thing. You got to continually stay in contact with your state health departments and make sure all the documentation is in place. You have to maintain your license to have that type of equipment on site, and inspections and audits. It prepares for and responds to these inspections and audits. The state has the responsibility and right to come inspect these facilities. So you're going to be that contact for the health department. All right, we're talking about labeling and posting, how vital it is. All right, so really with anything in safety, it's essential for ensuring not only the safety, compliance, and the awareness and environment. So if people walking in that area and have no clue about that piece of machinery, it's good to have that type of labeling so they understand, hey, this is an X-ray piece of equipment. I need to keep my distance if I'm not trained properly. So it has that immediate hazard identification, all right, prevention of accidental exposure. So if that thing's running, we want to keep people out, like we said. Employee protection. Workers handling or working near radiation equipment are informed about that nature of the device that they're working with. So these are the three kind of signs you need to have. All right. So it needs to have a posting of a caution X-ray equipment on there. All right. You need to have labeling. All analytical X-ray equipment shall be labeled with the reasonable signs or signs bearing that radiation symbol and a label bearing the words caution radiation. This equipment produces radiation when energized. A lot of the cabinet X-rays you will see, it will already be labeled on there for you. A lot of times they will laser engrave it on you, which is very efficient, so you don't have to keep replacing labels on those pieces of equipment. And lastly, if you're working with a high intensity X-ray beam, of course, you got to have one more signage that has that radiation symbol, caution, high intensity X-ray beam is in action. Warning lights. Every cabinet X-ray is going to have some type of warning light on it. It has to be easily visible, warning light labeled with the words X-ray on. This picture shows a prime example of it. Having similar tint shall be located near any switch that energizes that X-ray tube and shall be illuminated only when that tube is energized. So a lot of these pieces of equipment will actually be some type of safety interlock on them as well. So when that light bulb's out, it won't allow that equipment to run at the same time. So if you're ever inspecting equipment in your facilities, you're walking by, it's running, and that light's not on, there's a problem there. You need to get that fixed. One more sign from South Carolina that they want you to kind of post. It must be posted in a sufficient number of places in every establishment where employees are employed and activities licensed or registered. A good tip, I always tell people, right out in the break room with the other OSHA materials, your safety billboards, throw this thing up here. All right, plenty copies, post them out so people can see. This is something they will look at on the inspection process as well. Safety devices. All right, so you need to test all safety devices. You're talking about your interlocks, your shutters, warning lights. They need to be conducted annually for all operable analytical X-ray equipment. And you have to document. Remember, if you don't document, it's no proof that it actually got done. I always tell people kind of a great thing and just tip to do. If you have any type of PM service with your maintenance people that looks at the pieces of equipment, add it to that PM sheet. All right, add it. We check safety and light. The light was working, so you get it on a not just annual basis, but whether it's monthly, weekly, quarterly, you have that documentation in place. All right. Each X-ray tube housing shall be constructed to prevent that radiation leak, and you prove that by the inspections, the surveys that has that documentation to prove that everything is contained inside of that cabinet X-ray. All right. Then, if you do any repair or modifications to this X-ray system, all right, so there is no operation involving removal of covers, your shielding materials, or tube housings, or any different type of modifications, unless you can assure that that tube is off and will remain off at all times. A lot of times companies really don't do a lot of repairs on the cabinet X-rays themselves. They have the actual manufacturer them come in and do those type of major repairs if they're changing out a tube or changing out any type of shielding. All right, so operating procedures. All right, so operating procedures for that X-ray equipment are crucial for ensuring safety, your compliance, and regulation. You've heard me say that a couple of times, and it's just the overall effectiveness of use of that piece of equipment. All right, so the registrant needs to create, make available to all the people that are operating that piece of equipment those procedures. Okay, some things that you need to include inside that procedure: any type of personal monitoring. What type of devices are we using? How often are we turning them in to get the results done from them? How do we control and access to the radiation areas? All right, to show who's going in there. Are they qualified? Are they trained? Procedures for locking and securing the X-ray unit. A lot of them will have safety doors that are interlocked just like anything else with the machinery. So when you open up that door that might expose that person, it's going to shut off that X-ray. Procedures for pregnant employees. I always recommend if they are aware of the situation, you need to move them away from that. And there is some documentation you can have get done you just need to keep another eye on them and just protect them from that dose. And then training for new employees. Any new employee that you might see working around that piece of equipment, we said it before, you need to have them trained. All right, it doesn't have to be extensive. They just need to know about radiation awareness. And we'll go over here some items that is in kind of the regulation for South Carolina, what needs to be trained. All right, so word for word, no person shall be permitted to operate, repair, modify, or maintain that equipment until trained on the following. So here's some items. You talked about the identification of radiation hazards, what it is, how you handle it, what are the hazards, all right? The warning and safety devices. So if you have all those devices properly set up on your piece of equipment, you need to show people those devices. What do they mean? What do these labels mean? The operation of the equipment, whether it's running smoothly. If you need to emergency stop that piece of equipment, where do they need to touch in the items to stop that? It's very vital for them to have a great understanding of the piece of equipment. The survey instruments, if you have any survey device or reader inside your facility, they need to know how to operate that as well. Whether it's just the RSO using it, they still need awareness level. Characteristics of the radiation, how you control the dose, the units of dose, personnel monitoring, the symptoms of acute localized exposures, and then again, procedures for reporting any type of overexposure. This is something we can help kind of bundle that operating procedures and help you out. But please, anybody around that equipment, they're going to look for some training documentation for that. Now for the surveys, which I was talking about. You can do this many different ways, all right? But South Carolina requires you at least do it every 12 months. That is after installation. When you install a piece of equipment, it needs to go through some type of radiation survey as well. A lot of times you'll see the manufacturer actually do one before they release that equipment to you. Any change in that initial arrangement of that piece of equipment. All right, so if you were to remove the equipment across your facility, all right, you talk about needs to be surveyed again. Why? There's some delicate parts in there. You talk about that X-ray tube or the shielding or the guarding. Something could be knocked loose. The guarding doesn't work as well, and it could be the shielding is just not as effective. So make sure if you move it from this designated area, make sure you get it surveyed again. Make sure everything is running correctly. All right. Changes in operator or parameters of X-ray equipment can also significantly impact the quality of X-ray results. So you're talking about, and this is more what manufacturers can kind of adjust, but you can as well. So if you're changing the voltage, the current, kind of the exposure time and distance, it requires the understanding of how variable affects that X-ray beam. So we need to have some type of survey on that. A lot of times people won't adjust those original settings for that piece of equipment, but if you do, please get that survey done as well. All right, so disassembly or removing any components inside that piece of equipment. All right, it can carry it out with great care to ensure the safety of the personnel, proper functioning of that equipment. You talk about your X-ray systems contain those sensitive parts, like I mentioned, your X-ray tubes, high voltage power supplies, all your cooling systems. You want to make sure if you disassemble anything or change anything, a survey must be completed to verify everything's in good working order. And then lastly, if you are doing dosimetry reports and quarterly reports and surveys, and something is drastically wrong, you get that increase in radiation exposure on those reports, it's proving that something is wrong, okay? So get somebody in here, do a full-blown survey on that piece of equipment, whether it's a from the manufacturer of the equipment that you actually use, just to provide kind of assurance that that equipment, it could be something that's just the shielding is knocked out of place and those radiation is just kind of leaking out more and often. All right, air monitor. Monitors may be used in place of that annual radiation survey. So on the right side, you see kind of a badge set up that you can set that badge up around that piece of equipment, and it can provide constant data of what's being read on that machine. All right, so a TOD badge, which is the one on the right side, it's just a radiation dosimetry that uses materials that actually will emit when they are heated. All right, the light emission is proportional to the amount of radiation exposure the material has received. These usually get done quarterly. All right, you send them to a company, they read them, and they'll send you back some fresh ones as well. We can discuss some different type of companies if you ever need some referrals to anybody that can help you out get those type of badges into your facility. All right, documentation. There's a lot of documents with these pieces of equipment, and for a reason. All right, they do have a hazard presented with them, and the state and federal guidelines do want to make sure everything's taken care of. So documentation wise, you need to have a model, serial numbers of every single X-ray tube and controls you have in your facility. They need to be maintained and verify that the numbers match up to that piece of equipment. Records need to at least really be kept for 5 years when it comes to surveys. If you're doing any type of testing or performance tests, any PMs, maintenance, modifications with inside that piece of equipment, keep it for 5 years or that next State Department inspection. Right now, unless something has changed with going from DHEC to Department of Environmental Services, they were inspecting every 5 years. So keep it, anything you do with that piece of equipment, document it and hold on to it, all right, for that inspection. Correspondence with the State Department, any type of communication between your company and the State Departments, document it, hold on to it, all right. I'll always say, build that relationship. They're there to help. I have used them quite often back in my day when I was controlling X-ray equipment. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone, ask questions. They're there to guide you in the right direction. They will help you with the proper documentation, your next steps if you truly are confused, and we can help you with that process as well. All right. Lastly, training records, not just your training record as any RSO, but anybody that is trained that annual radiation awareness type training, hold on to it, document it for that inspection process like everything else. Registration. All right, so if you receive, possess, use, or acquire any X-ray machine, you need to register the control and tubes of such machine with the State Department. And we're going to go over each kind of list on that. There's a facility application fee, a new equipment, shooting plan, vendor, out of state, and also a report of change. And we're going to go through each one. All right, so facility-wise, you cannot bring on any type of piece of radiation source or X-ray equipment until you actually register your facility with the state. All right, you must go through that registration. You will be required to pay a registration fee before acceptance. This is kind of the first step of getting that equipment into your facility. Right side is kind of a screenshot of what the documentation does. I am more than happy to help you walk through this process. It's very efficient and easy, but it has to be done before you even really think about getting that piece of equipment into your facility. Next is anytime you get a new equipment or you're actually deleting equipment from your roster, all right, you have to do this form as well. So register the machine, control, and tubes within 30 calendar days of installation. I will say the state of South Carolina is a little bit easier on registration of new pieces of equipment. Hopefully nobody on this call is working in Maryland because they actually require you to be registered before that machine comes onto site. So you have to send off all that documentation. Sometimes machinery gets kind of sneaky getting into machine facilities overnight. So please, anybody that is buying these pieces of equipment and you're working in some states, that you need to be aware of the situation before it gets on site. Okay. And then once you're done with that registration, the state will send a registration sticker, and you just need to make sure that sticker with all the machine information is matching up with your documentation as well. Shielding registration, when it comes to industrial and analytical X-ray equipment, so your cabinet X-rays, sometimes they're exempt from actually having a shielding plan just because the majority of those cabinet X-rays, where everything is kind of contained within that cabinet. All right. Recommend discussing it with the state. It might not be true for every situation when it comes to a cabinet X-rays, but they can kind of give you a yes or no on that assurance. But if you are under that guideline where you need a shielding plan, here's the form right here. And make sure you fill it out to completion before you, again, start bringing any type of equipment into your facility. Vendor registration. So if you are a company building, making, assembling these at other facilities, you got to make sure you are registered through the state as well. I always advise companies that are buying X-rays from third parties, make sure they have a registration number too. There's been situations where vendors are selling equipment to companies and they're actually not registered in the state of South Carolina or the state of North Carolina. And what it's going to do, it's going to hang up your registration process, because definitely on your form, they're going to want a vendor registration and they won't accept your registration if they're not qualified. So talk to the people before you buy them. Make sure they have that proper registration, their documentation in place before you purchase any type of equipment from another manufacturer. Out of state. So if you're in a situation where you are kind of moving equipment from state to state, you're just doing a quick job, there's an out-of-state registration form that you have to send into the department and make sure you got all the proper qualifications, and there has to be a written notice to the agency at least 5 working days before that machine is actually used in the state of South Carolina. Different states will have different guidelines on that. Just refer to their state regulatory programs to get the accurate information. Report of change. This is something that sometimes doesn't get done, but it is very, very important. Okay, so if any changes in your program, I'm talking about if you get bought out by a company or you merge with the company, your name changes, you need to send in a report of change. If you go from one facility A to facility B, you got to have a report of change. Any type of contact information that changes, change of billing contacts, anything that really changed was inside your program. You need to have a report of change form and send it off to the state. And lastly, I always recommend if you're an RSO and leave the company, you need, before you leave that company, make sure you send in that form to let them know I'm no longer an RSO at that facility. You don't want them following you. So any change, we're filling out this form right here. And of course, with anything, they're going to ask for an annual fee too. All right, so annual registration fee per equipment tube. You look on the right side, there's different price ranges. So if you had a cabinet X-ray, which we've been talking about, it's going to be an annual fee per tube of $124. All right, so if you have 10, 15, that does add up. They will send that registration and that fee to you. Get it paid within 30 days. Failure to pay after 30 days will result in a fine. And if you continuously not pay it, after 60 days will result in actually registration being revoked. And I'm sure there's going to be some additional fees if you want to re-up that registration. So make sure you get that. If anybody, that's very vital why you have the correct information on your registration. So all that documentation from the state comes to the correct person. You do not want to get lost in the mail and you find out that your registration has been revoked, because it could cause some problems. All the information today was through South Carolina. Like I said, they have many different forms, and I believe they're updating because they're going from DHEC to Department of Environmental Services now with the split. But all the information here, and if you have this documentation, it's about 500 pages. You find your type of X-rays, and they can narrow it down to exactly what you need for your type of equipment in your facility. We're more than happy to pick up the phone, talk, and discuss anything you might need around the RSO and around your radiological program.